Snowflakes clung to my hair as I stood barefoot on the marble porch, my breath shaking in the icy air. Charles didn't care. His hand was wrapped around my suitcase handle as he dragged it across the floor, the wheels scraping like a threat. He stopped at the doorway, looked me dead in the eye, and said in a voice colder than the night around us, "You're dead weight, Maddie. My company is rising, and I'm not dragging a useless wife with me." Then, with one violent shove, he kicked my suitcase off the porch. It tumbled onto the frozen ground, and then he slammed the door. Not a word of explanation, not a hint of remorse, just finality. The shock hit me before the cold did. My knees nearly buckled. My own husband had just thrown me out of our home, no warning, no conversation, after the $500 million acquisition I helped structure. I pressed my palm to the door, not to beg, but because I needed one more second to understand how he had become this cruel. My name is Madeline Price, and until 24 hours before that night, I thought I had a stable marriage. I'm a corporate strategist, quiet, observant, the kind of woman who solves problems before anyone else even sees them. I never imagined I'd be standing outside my own house in the snow, trying to understand why the man I built a life with suddenly treated me like a stranger. Charles and I met at a business conference in Boston 7 years ago. He was charming, ambitious, full of ideas about building his investment firm. I was drawn to his confidence, the way he talked about creating something meaningful. We married within a year, and I left my consulting job to work alongside him at Whitaker Capital. I became his strategist, his problem solver, the one who turned his big dreams into workable plans. But somewhere along the way, things changed. The man who once valued my input started dismissing my ideas. The partnership became a hierarchy where I was always beneath him. I walked away from the house that night, my feet numb against the frozen driveway. Each step felt like I was leaving pieces of myself behind. My mind kept replaying his words over and over. Dead weight, useless wife. I'd heard him criticize me before, small comments about my opinions or my work, but this was different. This was rejection wrapped in cruelty, delivered without a second thought. The cold bit into my skin, but I barely felt it. The real pain was deeper in that hollow space where trust used to live. I kept walking, not sure where I was going, just knowing I couldn't stay there. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out with shaking hands. 3 missed calls from Alicia, my best friend. She must have sensed something was wrong. I called her back, my voice breaking as soon as she answered. "Alicia, I need help," I whispered. "I'm coming," she said immediately. "Where are you?" 20 minutes later, I was sitting on Alicia's couch, wrapped in blankets, holding a mug of tea I couldn't drink. She sat beside me, her hand on my shoulder, waiting for me to speak. When I finally did, the words came out broken and scattered. "He kicked me out," I said, staring at the steam rising from my cup. "Charles just threw my suitcase out the door and told me I'm dead weight." Alicia's eyes widened, anger flashing across her face. "He did what?" I nodded, feeling the weight of it settle over me again. No warning, no conversation, just done. She pulled me into a hug, and I finally let myself cry. Not loud, dramatic sobs, just quiet tears that felt like they'd been building for months. "You can stay here as long as you need," Alicia said firmly. "And tomorrow, we're going to figure out what to do next." I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I just knew tonight had broken something inside me that I wasn't sure could be fixed. The next morning, I woke up on Alicia's couch feeling hollow. My body ached from the cold, but my mind was sharper than it had been in months. I started thinking back, trying to pinpoint when Charles changed. It wasn't overnight. It was gradual, like watching a crack spread slowly across glass. I remember dinners where I'd share ideas about client strategies, and he'd nod absently, then use those exact ideas in meetings without crediting me. I remembered the way he started introducing me to investors as my wife, instead of my business partner. I remembered the night I suggested restructuring a failing deal, and he laughed, saying, "Leave the real strategy to people who understand finance, Maddie." At the time, I'd brushed it off, telling myself he was stressed, that he didn't mean it. But looking back now, I saw the pattern. He'd been erasing me piece by piece, making me smaller so he could feel bigger, and I'd let him. I swallowed my pride, stayed quiet, kept working in his shadow. The $500 million acquisition was supposed to be Charles's biggest triumph. Whitaker Capital was acquiring a mid-sized tech firm called Novatech, and the deal was complex, full of risks that needed careful planning. Charles brought me in to analyze the numbers, map out the integration strategy, and draft the legal framework. I spent 3 months on that deal, working late nights, catching problems before they became disasters. I wrote a restructuring clause that protected Whitaker Capital if Novatech's revenue projections fell short. It was technical, buried in legal language, the kind of detail most people would skim over. Charles never read it carefully. He just signed where his lawyer told him to sign. That clause quietly transferred 35% ownership of the restructured entity to me, a safeguard I'd built in case the deal went south. I never told Charles about it. At the time, I thought I was just protecting both of us. Now, sitting in Alicia's apartment, I realized I'd accidentally protected myself from him. A week before Charles kicked me out, something changed at the office. I'd been working on a client presentation, analyzing market trends for a potential investment. I sent my strategy memo to Charles like I always did, expecting him to review it before the meeting. But when I walked into the conference room the next morning, I saw something that stopped me cold. Charles was presenting my work, word for word, but the memo he was holding had someone else's name on it. Fiona Caldwell. She was a new consultant Charles had hired a month earlier, brought in to add fresh perspective, he'd said. She sat at the table, smiling confidently as if those ideas were hers. I stood in the doorway, stunned, waiting for Charles to correct the mistake. He didn't. He finished the presentation, the board applauded, and Fiona thanked them graciously. After the meeting, I pulled Charles aside. "That was my memo," I said quietly. He shrugged. "Fiona polished it, made it better." It wasn't better. It was mine. The humiliation reached its peak at a dinner party Charles hosted for potential investors. It was held at our home. A carefully staged event designed to impress wealthy clients. I played the role I always did, smiling, making small talk, ensuring everything ran smoothly. During dinner, one of the investors asked about the Novatech acquisition. "The restructuring strategy was brilliant," he said, looking at Charles. "How did you anticipate those risks?" Charles grinned, soaking up the praise. "Experience," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "You learn to see patterns others miss." I sat across from him, my wine glass trembling slightly in my hand. I'd written that strategy, I'd caught those risks, but Charles didn't even glance my way. Then he said it. "Maddie helped with some of the spreadsheets. Little details, you know." The table chuckled politely and my face burned. Little spreadsheets, that's what he reduced my work to. I forced a smile, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass until I thought it might snap. That night, something inside me finally cracked. 2 days after the dinner party, I discovered something that shattered what little trust I had left. I was looking for a document in Charles's home office when I found a folder labeled Legal Revisions. Inside were papers from our lawyer, dated 3 weeks earlier. It was a proposed amendment to our prenuptial agreement. The original prenup had been fair, protecting both our assets equally if we ever divorced. But this new version was different. It stripped me of any claim to Whitaker Capital, the company I'd helped build. It reduced my share of our joint investments to almost nothing, and Charles had already signed it. The only reason it wasn't finalized was because I hadn't signed yet. He'd been planning this. For weeks, maybe months, he'd been preparing to cut me out completely. I stared at those papers, my hands shaking, feeling betrayed in a way I'd never experienced before. He wasn't just dismissing me anymore. He was erasing me, legally and financially, from the life we'd built together. The final argument happened the night before he kicked me out. I confronted him about the prenup amendment, holding the papers in my hand, demanding an explanation. Charles barely looked up from his laptop. "It's just a precaution," he said casually. "The company's growing and I need to protect my assets." "Your assets," I said, my voice rising. "I built half of this with you, Charles. I wrote the strategies, analyzed the deals, and fixed your mistakes." He finally looked at me, his expression cold and dismissive. "You helped, Maddie. That's not the same as building. I'm the one investors trust. I'm the name on the door." I felt something break inside me, like the last thread holding us together had finally snapped. "I'm lucky you took me in," I whispered, repeating the words he'd said weeks earlier during another argument. He nodded as if it were obvious. "Yeah, you are." I walked out of his office that night, knowing our marriage was already over. I just didn't know he'd make it official the very next day. There was one document Charles never paid attention to, one clause buried in the Novatech acquisition papers that would change everything. When I drafted the restructuring agreement, I included a provision that transferred 35% ownership of the merged entity to me if certain conditions were met. Those conditions were tied to revenue thresholds and operational benchmarks, things I knew Novatech would hit within the first 6 months. Charles's lawyer had reviewed it, but only briefly, focusing on the liability protections and investor terms. Charles himself never read it carefully. He just signed where he was told to sign, too focused on closing the deal to worry about details. I hadn't done it maliciously. At the time, I genuinely thought I was protecting us both, ensuring I had a stake in the company I'd worked so hard to build. But now, sitting in Alicia's apartment, I realized that clause was the only thing standing between me and complete financial ruin. Charles had tried to erase me, but I'd accidentally left myself a way back in. 3 days after Charles kicked me out, I received a call that changed everything. It was Martin Hayes, the CFO of Whitaker Capital. His voice was tight, stressed in a way I'd never heard before. "Maddie, I need to talk to you," he said. "It's about the Novatech deal." My stomach tightened. "What's wrong?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "The integration's falling apart. The clients don't trust Charles's team. They're asking for you." I sat up straighter, my heart pounding. "What do you mean, asking for me?" "They want the person who wrote the original strategy," Martin explained. "They've seen the restructuring clause. They know you own 35%, and they're threatening to pull out unless you're involved in stabilizing the merger." I closed my eyes, processing what he was saying. Charles had kicked me out, erased my contributions, tried to bury me. But the deal I'd built was collapsing without me, and now they needed me back. "I'll think about it," I said quietly and hung up. For the first time since that night in the snow, I felt something other than pain. I felt power. Charles discovered the ownership clause the same day Martin called me. I wasn't there to see it, but Martin told me later what happened. Charles had been in a meeting with his lawyer, reviewing the Novatech financials, when the lawyer casually mentioned the restructuring provision. "You know Madeline owns 35%, right?" the lawyer said. Charles froze. "What are you talking about?" The lawyer pulled up the document, pointing to the clause I'd written months earlier. Charles's face went white, then red, then white again. "How did this happen?" he shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. "You signed it," the lawyer said calmly. "I flagged it during review, but you said it was fine." Charles grabbed his phone, scrolling through emails, searching for any mention of the clause. There was nothing. He'd been too arrogant, too confident to pay attention to the details. Now those details were coming back to destroy him. He tried calling me that afternoon. I saw his name flash across my screen and let it ring out. I wasn't ready to talk to him yet. I wanted him to sit in that panic a little longer. The desperation in Charles's voice was something I'd never heard before. He called again that evening, and this time I answered, curiosity getting the better of me. "Maddie," he said, his voice tight and strained. "We need to talk." "About what?" I asked, keeping my tone flat and emotionless. "About the deal, about us. I made a mistake and I need your help fixing it." I almost laughed. A mistake. That's what he was calling it now. Not cruelty, not betrayal, just a simple mistake that needed fixing. "You kicked me out, Charles," I said quietly. "You told me I was dead weight. You threw my suitcase into the snow." He was silent for a moment, then said, "I was stressed. The deal was overwhelming and I wasn't thinking clearly." "You were thinking clearly enough to plan a prenup amendment," I shot back. "You were thinking clearly enough to replace my work with Fiona's." He exhaled sharply. "Please, Maddie, the board wants you involved. The clients want you. I can't do this without you." I felt a strange calm settle over me. For years, I'd wanted Charles to see my value, to recognize what I brought to the table. Now he finally did, but it was too late. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up before he could respond. 2 days later, I received a formal request from the Whitaker Capital Board. They wanted me to attend an emergency meeting to discuss the Novatech integration. The email was polite but firm, emphasizing that my presence was critical to stabilizing the deal. Alicia helped me pick out an outfit, something sharp and professional, the kind of look that commanded respect. "You're going to walk in there and show them exactly who you are," she said, adjusting my collar. When I arrived at the Whitaker Capital offices, the receptionist looked surprised to see me. "Ms. Price," she said, standing quickly. "They're waiting for you in the boardroom." I walked down the familiar hallway, my heels clicking against the marble floor, feeling a strange mix of nerves and confidence. When I entered the boardroom, every head turned. Charles sat at the far end of the table, his face pale and tense. Fiona was there too, looking uncomfortable. Martin nodded at me, gesturing to an empty chair. I sat down, calm and composed, and waited for someone to speak. Finally, the board chairman cleared his throat. "Ms. Price, thank you for coming. We need your help." The meeting revealed more than I expected. Martin laid out the problems with the Novatech integration, client concerns, revenue shortfalls, operational gaps that Charles's team had failed to address. But then Fiona spoke, and the room went silent. "I need to be honest," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Charles inflated the revenue projections. He told me to adjust the numbers to make the deal look better than it was." The board members exchanged glances, shock rippling through the room. Charles's face went red. "That's not true," he said, his voice rising. Fiona pulled out a folder, handing it to the chairman. "I have emails. He instructed me to revise the forecasts and hide the shortfalls from the clients." The chairman flipped through the documents, his expression hardening. "Is this accurate, Mr. Whitaker?" Charles stammered, trying to deflect, but the evidence was right there in black and white. I sat quietly, watching him unravel. This wasn't my doing. This was the consequence of his own arrogance, his own dishonesty. The board turned on him, voices rising, demanding explanations. And for the first time since that night in the snow, I felt something close to justice. The board asked me to stay after the meeting ended. Charles was escorted out, his face tight with barely controlled rage, and Fiona left quietly, looking relieved. The chairman turned to me. "Ms. Price, we need your help stabilizing this acquisition. You understand the deal better than anyone." I nodded slowly, considering my options. I could walk away, let Charles's company collapse under the weight of his mistakes. Or I could step in, reclaim the work I'd done, and show everyone what I was truly capable of. "I'll help," I said, "but I have conditions." The chairman leaned forward. "Name them." "I work directly with the board, not through Charles," I said. "I want full access to all financial records and operational data, and I want my contributions formally recognized in all client communications." The chairman nodded. "Done." I pulled out a contract I drafted with Alicia's help the night before, outlining strict professional boundaries, no personal contact with Charles, no reconciliation discussions. This was business, nothing more. They signed it without hesitation. As I walked out of that boardroom, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control over my own life. Charles tried to reassert his dominance the next day. He showed up at the office while I was reviewing the Novatech financials with Martin. He walked into the conference room without knocking, his presence filling the space with tension. "Maddie, we need to talk," he said, his tone somewhere between demanding and desperate. I didn't look up from the spreadsheet. "I'm working." "This is my company," he said, his voice rising. "You can't just come in here and take over." I finally looked at him, my expression calm and unbothered. "I'm not taking over, Charles. I'm fixing your mistakes." He opened his mouth to argue, but Martin interrupted. "Mr. Whitaker, the board has asked Ms. Price to handle the integration directly. If you have concerns, you can take them up with the chairman." Charles's face flushed red, but he didn't have a response. He'd always controlled the narrative, always been the one with the power. Now, watching him stand there, powerless and irrelevant, I realized something important. His authority had never come from competence. It had come from my silence, and I wasn't silent anymore. The real crisis hit 3 days into my work with the board. One of the major investors in the Novatech deal, a venture capital firm called Meridian Group, announced they were withdrawing their $50 million commitment. Their statement was brief but devastating. "We have concerns about the leadership and transparency at Whitaker Capital." The news spread through the office like wildfire. Charles immediately called an emergency meeting, trying to spin the situation, blaming external market conditions and client misunderstandings. But the board wasn't buying it. "They don't trust you, Charles," the chairman said bluntly. "They trust Madeline." Charles turned to me, his eyes filled with anger and something that looked almost like fear. "This is your fault," he said. "You turned them against me." I shook my head slowly. "I haven't spoken to the Meridian Group. They made this decision based on your actions, not mine." Martin pulled up an email thread, showing it to the board. "Meridian reached out to Ms. Price directly," he said. "They want assurance she's leading the integration before they'll reconsider their investment." The room fell silent. Charles had been trying to push me out, but the investors wanted me in. The irony was almost painful. I initiated a full internal audit of the Novatech acquisition, something Charles had been avoiding for weeks. With the board's approval, I brought in an independent accounting firm to review every transaction, every projection, every communication related to the deal. What they found was worse than I'd expected. Charles had been covering up losses, moving money between accounts to hide shortfalls, and misrepresenting the financial health of the merger to both investors and the board. It wasn't outright fraud, but it was close. Reckless, dishonest. The kind of behavior that could destroy a company's reputation overnight. I documented everything methodically, factually, without emotion. I presented my findings to the board in a clear, organized report that left no room for misinterpretation. The chairman read through it in silence, his jaw tightening with each page. "This is unacceptable," he said finally, looking at Charles. "You've put the entire company at risk." Charles tried to defend himself, claiming he was just trying to save the deal, that the pressure had been overwhelming. But his excuses fell flat. The numbers didn't lie, and I'd made sure of that. The second twist came from Fiona. A week after her initial confession, she submitted a formal report to the board detailing additional misconduct. Charles had pressured her to falsify market research, inflate client interest, and cover up negative feedback from the Novatech management team. She provided emails, recorded conversations, and internal memos that painted a damning picture of Charles's leadership. The board called another emergency meeting, this time without Charles present. They reviewed Fiona's evidence, cross-referencing it with the audit I'd conducted. The pattern was clear. Charles had been cutting corners, hiding problems, and blaming others when things went wrong. "We have no choice," the chairman said quietly. "We need to suspend him pending a full investigation." I sat there, watching the consequences of Charles's arrogance finally catch up to him. I hadn't orchestrated this. I'd simply told the truth, documented the facts, and let them speak for themselves. Sometimes justice doesn't require revenge. It just requires honesty. The board voted unanimously to suspend Charles, effective immediately. He would be barred from all company operations until the investigation concluded. For the first time in 7 years, Whitaker Capital would operate without him. Boardroom felt different the day Charles was officially removed from control. The air was lighter, less tense, as if a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. The chairman addressed the room, his voice steady and firm. "Effective immediately, Charles Whitaker is suspended from all operational and strategic roles at Whitaker Capital. An external investigation will determine his future with the company." Charles wasn't present for the announcement. He'd been asked to stay home, and for once he'd complied. I sat at the table, feeling a strange mix of emotions. This wasn't anger or satisfaction. It was simply the natural consequence of years of arrogance and dishonesty catching up to him. The board turned to me. "Ms. Price, we'd like you to serve as interim CEO during this transition," the chairman said. "You understand the company's operations, and you have the trust of our investors and clients." I took a breath, considering the weight of what he was asking. This was the company I'd helped build, the work I'd poured my life into, but it was also tied to the man who'd betrayed me. "I'll do it," I said finally. "On one condition. This company moves forward with transparency, integrity, and respect for every person who works here." The board agreed without hesitation. As I walked out of that meeting, I realized something important. I wasn't just rebuilding a company, I was rebuilding myself. Charles cornered me in the hallway outside my new office 3 days after the announcement. I was carrying a stack of files, reviewing client communications, when I heard his voice behind me. "Maddie, please, I need to talk to you." I turned slowly, keeping my expression neutral. He looked different, smaller somehow, his confidence stripped away. "What do you want, Charles?" "I need your help," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I messed up, but you can't let them destroy everything I built." I stared at him, remembering all the times I'd needed his support and he'd dismissed me. All the times I'd asked to be seen, valued, respected. "Everything you built," I said quietly. "You mean everything we built?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing his mistake. "I needed you too," I continued, my voice steady. "I needed you to see me as a partner, not a burden. I needed you to value my work, not steal credit for it." He reached out like he wanted to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "Please," he whispered. "I'm sorry." I looked at him one last time, seeing the man I'd once loved buried under years of arrogance and cruelty. "I needed you too. Once," I said. Then I walked away, leaving him standing alone in that empty hallway. The final board vote happened on a cold Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Charles had kicked me out. The investigation had concluded, confirming everything Fiona and I had documented. Charles's mismanagement, his dishonesty, his pattern of blaming others for his failures. The board called a special session to determine his future with the company. I sat at the table, holding my 35% ownership stake, knowing my vote would be decisive. The chairman laid out the options. Charles could be demoted, reassigned to a non-leadership role, or removed entirely. The room fell silent, waiting for someone to speak first. I cleared my throat, feeling the weight of the moment. "I vote to remove Charles Whittaker from all positions at Whittaker Capital," I said, my voice calm and clear. "His actions have compromised the company's integrity, and his leadership has proven harmful to both employees and investors." One by one, the other board members voted. Every single one agreed with me. Charles was out completely and permanently. I sat there, watching the votes tally up, and felt something unexpected. Not triumph or revenge, just a quiet sense of closure. Charles had tried to erase me, diminish my contributions, and cast me aside. But in doing so, he'd given me the chance to reclaim everything he'd tried to take. The company I'd helped build was finally free from the man who'd nearly destroyed it, and I was free too. I moved into a new apartment 2 weeks later, a bright space with large windows overlooking the city. It wasn't as big as the house I'd shared with Charles, but it was mine, filled with light and possibility. I set up a small office in the corner, decorated with plants and framed photos of people who'd supported me through everything. Alicia, Martin, even Fiona, who'd found the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. Work at Whittaker Capital was demanding but rewarding. I restructured the leadership team, bringing in people who valued collaboration and transparency. I rebuilt relationships with investors, personally reaching out to explain the changes and our commitment to integrity. Meridian Group reinstated their $50 million investment after a meeting where I laid out our new strategic vision. Other investors followed, and within a month, the company was more stable than it had been in years. I started receiving messages from women I'd never met, people who'd heard my story and felt inspired by it. They told me about their own struggles with being undervalued, dismissed, erased. And they thanked me for showing them that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud arrogance. I was building a new life, one where my worth wasn't determined by someone else's opinion of me. 3 months after that night in the snow, I was sitting in my office when an email notification popped up. It was a news article from a major business publication. The headline read, "Madeline Price leads record-breaking turnaround of Whittaker Capital." I clicked on it, reading about how the company's value had increased by 40% under my leadership, how investor confidence had been restored, and how clients were praising the new direction. There was a quote from the Meridian Group CEO. "Madeline Price is the kind of leader every company needs, strategic, honest, and deeply committed to doing what's right." I leaned back in my chair, a small smile crossing my face. Charles had faded into silence after his removal. No calls, no messages, no attempts to apologize or explain. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he was consulting for a small firm, trying to rebuild his reputation. I wished him no harm, but I also felt no need to reach out. Some chapters close completely, and that's okay. I closed my laptop, looked out at the city skyline, and whispered to myself, "Knowing your worth isn't revenge, but sometimes it looks like it." What would you do in this situation? If someone tried to erase your contributions and cast you aside, how would you respond? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own strength or inspired you to stand up for your worth, please hit that subscribe button. Every story we share here is about finding your voice, reclaiming your power, and building a life that reflects your true value. Don't forget to like this video and share your experiences. Your story matters, and I can't wait to hear it.